All right, it's 10:15. Sorry for the delay. Thank you, folks, for being here on time. That's fantastic. We are still experiencing some technical difficulties, but all the people who are supposed to be live here with you are live here and with you. So we'll get started, and hopefully while we're going, the technical stuff. It's not just about flash drives and PowerPoints and little fun graphics we want to show you. There is an additional panelist who, because of health reasons, could not make it, but is ready to Skype in. And we have Skype, and we have her. We just can't get it from here to there to there. So that's why we're having magic people do magic things with that. All right. So, my name is Meyer, and I'm very pleased and honored to open this forum, this panel, and a conversation we've listed as Revolution and Nonviolence, from Deming, Fanon, and Pan-Africanism to global movements today. And just to say, by way of brief introduction, a number of us have been for several years, including a couple of years running at the Left Forum, been talking about these apparently and occasionally viewed contradictory issues of revolution here and nonviolence here, with many people, a good number of people, saying you can only make revolution through armed struggle. It's the only real way to make a revolution. And other people saying, ugh, that violence stuff, it never works. Really, the only way to really make long-term transformative changes through nonviolent direct action, because violence always begets violence, and the means and the ends are always interconnected. And I think for most of us in this panel, we find both of those assertions uneasy. We are not comfortable with either of those definitive, absolutist assumptions. And yet we are committed both to complete radical transformation of the existing society, not only white supremacy, patriarchy, and imperialism here in the US, but globally. And we also feel like there's something about the power of nonviolence, something about a critique of militarism that needs to be made in the building of our revolutionary movements. So it's not an absolutist position, and it's not a position that has answers. It's not a position that any one of us pinpoint with an exact, this is it. But it is a position that has a number of us wanting to raise more deep questions about how we build our movements today, how we build our revolutionary movements today. And so in that conversation, the four of us and the fifth from Philadelphia have been engaged. And it's this conversation that we're going to have a little of here amongst ourselves, and then hopefully with you shortly after the presentations. So, as I welcome you into this conversation, let me also welcome this distinguished group of panelists. I'm really honored and pleased to have the founder and CEO of Africa World Red Sea Press, who, aside from publishing, I mean, what is it? I say thousands, but then every few hours you have to say, what is it, tens of thousands now? It just seems to grow exponentially. But not just the founder and CEO of Africa World Red Sea Press, but also a distinguished Pan-Africanist and an incredible, I think, an intellectual and activist giant himself, although I have to say a lot of the times, because he's doing publishing, he doesn't get asked to do public speaking. So I'm really honored and pleased that Kassahun Checole is going to be presenting first today. After Kassahun, we have Ynestra King, also in some ways an iconic figure, really, because there are many people who have been for many years concerned with feminist movements, and I put the S at the end of that intentionally, but also obviously involved in environmental movements. And Ynestra is one of the key people, maybe the key person, that theoretically and practically has taken those movements and created and focused on ecofeminism and what that can mean for a new world and a new society. In addition to that, she is one of the people who really both typifies the life of, but was also engaged in communication with and mentoring from Barbara Deming, who, if you don't know her, I mean, I think most folks here hopefully know Franz Fanon, and everyone has heard of Pan-Africanism, but Deming is less known. And so we want to, in some ways, reintroduce some of her thinking about these issues into the conversation, and Ynestra will do that. And then we have this younger colleague here, and we're very excited to have Hakim Williams. Hakim's full name is Hakim Mohandas Amani Williams, and I think the name alone talks about the multiple strains and lives that Hakim lives, Trinidadian, but a key educator and really concerned with the building of transformative and revolutionary educational movements. This is Wende trying to say, where the heck are you? I'll answer that and say, we're here, but not really. Yeah, I guess if worst case comes to worst, I'll just hold Wende up and my cell phone and she can, but that wouldn't be the best way of hearing it. So Hakim, apparently because of his youth, is also the technical director. So we thank him for that. And I guess without further ado, we're going to start off, not worry too much about the technical stuff. Hakim, really, you shouldn't. We have an official techie here. And please help me welcome our first speaker, Kassahun Checole.
Thank you all. I think I have to speak louder because we don't have a mic. Huh? I've been reflecting on this issue that Matt has just talked about, revolutions and their outcome, what they do, where they go, and what happens to them. I've been engaged in revolutionary action since I was 15 years old. A small country called Eritrea, at that time part of Ethiopia. My initial involvement in Pan-Africanism was a cultural and literature, and moved on to more active and militant participation in both the Marxist movement, the Ethiopian student movement, and the Marxist and critical movement of the Eritrean liberation movement. Between that journey, I was also involved with the independence movement of East Timor, the anti-apartheid movement, and the anti-colonial struggle all over Africa. So my range of interest goes through, and in the last 50 years of my involvement in struggles, now you can guess my age, right? I have begun in the last 10, 15 years to question our ways, our method of doing the action that we have done, where we're going, and how come we have not arrived where we thought we would be. Those are deep-rooted questions for myself. I'm not blaming anybody or accusing anyone, but since I was a participant, I reflect on the fact that my role may not have also been as good as it should have been. Limited as it is, small as it is. So I've been reflecting on this issue of where is Africa today and where are we going. So my short paper, it won't take too long, is to discuss with you the conditions, the present conditions of Africa. I divided into 3 parts. The first part is the early independence movement that began in the 1940s and 1950s that resulted in almost half of Africa becoming independent from colonial countries. Interestingly, the decolonization of Africa, or the independence movement of Africa, was immediately co-opted or enjoined or controlled by the nice guys who were colonialists. They managed to create structure, the means of controlling the newly independent country. They've done it very well. Kwame Nkrumah called it neo-colonialism. In a sense, it is a colonialism without their presence, physical presence, but controlling the whole apparatus of the economy, society, cultural, and other units of Africa. This is a major issue for us, because that has resulted in the colonial leftover corrupting the system that we were creating, corrupting it in the name of democracy, in the name of freedom, in which our earlier leaders have become paternalistic and patronizing, and they have remained in power, some of them up to today, okay, up to the present. They refuse to move and leave the space for other younger, innovative people, because they think as fathers, and they're mostly fathers, as fathers, they have a role to play. They have a role to guide. But the failure of their leadership is also very vivid, very clear. Because you see, when Africa got its formal independence from colonial powers, Asia was also at the same boat. Today's Malaysia became independent at the same time that Ghana became independent. But at least in the economic sense, Malaysia is way, way ahead of Ghana and other African countries. So we have to question, how come our leaders want to stay in power, but they haven't shown the capacity of someone like Mukhtar in Malaysia, or someone like the old man in Singapore, or the revolutionaries in China, who have some concrete things to show us today. Again, we may squabble about what it is that they can show us, the good and the bad of it, but the fact is that they have something to show. They have good education, good health systems, good services, good logistics, all of those things, at least in a material sense, says they've gone a little bit further than us. The man who exemplifies this age group is our good friend, Robert Mugabe. And I say good friend because Mugabe is a revolutionary. Whether you like him or not. Okay, so we can't deny him that, that title or that role. He played a significant revolutionary role in his country. His biggest and most tragic failure is not to leave on time and not having created the systems that are necessary to transit to new powers, new systems, new energy that should have come to that country. Among all Southern African countries, Zimbabwe has an incredible capacity to grow intellectually, economically, and otherwise. And unfortunately, Mugabe, his suppression of rights, his anti-feminist, homophobic attitude to life and society has forced thousands of educated Zimbabweans to flee their country. First, to the neighboring country of South Africa, in which they constitute 90% of the skilled labor among black people, okay? And the rest to the United States and Canada and Australia and all the other countries that don't need them, but will take them because they have the skills, okay? They're doctors and nurses and engineers, what have you. They were trained at the cost of the people of Zimbabwe. But Canada is benefiting, so is Australia, so is the United States, not the Zimbabweans. Today, you can't find a single doctor from one village to the 10th village next. It's just impossible. Those who are there are mostly in the urban centers. And they are very poorly paid that they have to take 2, 3 jobs at the same time. One of them, a good friend of mine, has a chicken coop behind his house. He's a medical doctor, trained in Oxford. Okay, that is what is left of our old leadership. It is a leadership that has been schooled by the West. Now, my notion is not to blame the West too much, because the West is a giver. It's an empire. It does what empires do. I take that for granted. I don't expect any charity or mercy from the West. The fault is mostly ours. We are the ones to be blamed. The question is, what did we not do to make sure that the West does not dominate our economies and societies? So that's our first problem. The second problem is what I call the second wave of revolutions that also began in the late 1950s but matured in the late 70s and 80s, with Algeria being the most revolutionary of African countries. But Cameroon, Ghana, Guinea follow. In the second wave of revolutions, we have countries like the South Africa, which fought in a global anti-apartheid movement led by the African National Congress and the Pan-Africanist National Congress, and ended up in a significant victory after the release of Nelson Mandela. He's an iconic name everybody knows. Okay. And then you have the former Portuguese colonies. That's Guinea-Bissau, Mozambique, Angola, Cape Verde, what have you, all, you can add them up. Those are second wave of revolutionaries, I call them second wave because they were revolutionaries led not just by the practical activity of decolonizing their country, but also with the ideological information of saying, this is our vision, a significant social order that has changed from the tradition and from the colonial modernity. So it is a revolution that challenges all tradition, archaic traditional systems, but also challenges the Western modern model because they didn't see it working and they didn't affect it. We always laugh at this idea of the elites coming in after the independence of Mozambique and looking around for truck drivers who can deal with the coal and mine and gold, what have you, piled up, and no one is there to move it. And they were asking foolish questions. Not who can drive these trucks, but who has a license to drive these cars. Of course, the colonials did not allow for Africans to have a license. But they didn't know how to drive the cars. So the guys were sitting there and saying, what do you want from us? I said, we want people who can drive this car, but they have to have a license. And they say, you must be kidding. We all drive these trucks. But we don't have any papers because the white friends would not give us papers that says he's a driving license. That is a level of ignorance of our intellectuals, our elites, not the people, because the people knew where they are and what they can do. So we encumbered anti-colonial struggle, a revolutionary struggle, in the second wave in Mozambique, Angola, and Guinea-Bissau, defined by a clear ideological mission, by a clear mission that says society has to change. It has to be less patriarchal, women have to play a role, and disabled people have to play a role. Society has to be renovated, people have to be educated. We have to move slowly from the countryside to the cities, and that way liberate the country to be productive and effective. So that second wave in itself, unfortunately, has now failed us. Angola is in a disaster, so is Mozambique, so is Guinea-Bissau, by and large. What has left from our post-revolutionary period is a group of people who are thinking more about their pockets rather than their people. In Angola, the president and his daughter have now become billionaires. The daughter is so rich, she loans money to Portugal, the former colonial power. Loans money to Portugal. Okay. She owns the airlines of Portugal. She owns the major hotels of England. Yet, when you go to Angola, you will see the depths of poverty, the ignorance, the lack of health facility that should have been there for the billions of money that the oil and the diamonds of Angola bring out. Okay. And yet the man refuses to leave. Mozambique is another creator. They've done a lot of work. However, they're also encumbered by their own past in which they're fighting with each other, and corruption is taking over in many, many places. Our revolutionary, second wave revolutionary, was inspired and influenced by global world revolutions. We looked at Vietnam, we looked at China, we looked at Cuba, we looked at all the campesino movements in Latin America, in Asia. Those were inspirational. Now, ideology and the practical heroism of our comrades across the seas actually inspired many of us to say, if they can do it, we can do it. Okay? If they can stand up against the mightiest power in the world, the United States of America, the least we could do is fight against Portugal. And it happened. We got there. Our dreams were very clearly based on the idea not only of getting rid of colonial powers and archaic orders, but having done that, to also construct new societies based on progressive social equity, social justice, and unleashing the economic might of Africa for the sole purpose of advancing the conditions of the population to a fair and accessible economic possibilities. We almost got the changes we desired, but only in a partial form. By the early 1990s, the apartheid and backward colonial orders had fallen in Southern Africa. Eritrea, a small country with a record as one of the longest fighting struggle in Africa, became liberated. Archaic orders in Eastern Africa in particular, in Ethiopia, Uganda, and Rwanda had fallen. These were the situations positively viewed in the 80s and 90s. These were the seasons of hope and possibility. It begs the question then, why indeed are where we are today? Why haven't we moved forward with those opportunities that we have run? So let me summarize 3 major points. One is the conditions in Southern Africa. South Africa is the main engine of Southern Africa, which contains almost 12 to 15 countries. It's the most progressive and potentially an economic powerhouse of the region. The Republic of South Africa is being mismanaged by a governance, although curtailed by the power of its most progressive constitution. And South Africa does have an incredibly progressive constitution and a functioning state apparatus. By and large, South Africa is being destabilized by its own leadership, rooted in the historic and revolutionary ANC, the African National Congress. The nation has some very real problems of massive inequality, lack of access to land and to the white economy, and a very slow process of integration of the impoverished masses to education, employment, health services, housing, and other basic needs. One would not want to minimize the mountain of challenges that South Africa faces. It's a nexus of reconciliation, so admired by many around the world, but its inability to address the historic divisions of color and class, the economic balances, remain a real problem. So if we go, to cut my presentation a little bit, if we go further to Northeast Africa, we face it with a leadership in Northeast Africa that remains to accept that the people can make their own decisions, that they can be the actors of change. So you find, like in places like Uganda, Eritrea, Rwanda, Ethiopia, and Kenya, governments are simply refusing to hand over power to the next generation. They are either changing the constitution to fit their needs, the government needs, or simply said constitutions are not necessary because our people are not ready to converse with constitution. Okay. These are the people who brought them to power. And they are now saying these people are not ready to converse on constitutional matters. So that is the real problem we face in East Africa in particular. The East African revolutionaries have made tremendous amount of impact on their economies. East Africa is today one of the fastest growing economies in the world, better than the United States and better than Europe. East African countries are growing between 7 to 12% annual rate. Of course, this is capitalist growth. It doesn't talk about inequality. It doesn't talk about poverty. So we have 3 major problems. One is while growth is there, the inequality still grows at the same rate. The governments refuse to provide people self-rule. Third is that the war between the cousins, Eritrea and Ethiopia, is still a major hurdle for the possibility of a united East Africa, larger East Africa, Northeast Africa, I would call it. These countries created an organization called IGAD, which is meant to be a stepping stone to a single union, but cannot be materialized. So finally, I want to conclude with this item. In the old days, in theory, we talked about the population bomb. You remember that theory, right? The world is about to explode with too many people. We're going to have major problems. That is the climate issue of that time. I say that's just bull. The real problem we face today, at least in the context of Africa, that I can talk alternatively, is a demographic divide. demographic divide between the old and the young, between those who have remained in power because of their past deeds and the young ones who want to bring in new ideas, innovative thinking, and doing it in reality. This divide, what I call the post-revolutionary children of Africa and their fathers and mothers, is a critical issue. The majority of Africa is young people. We're talking about a division between 60 to 65% to young people in the whole of Africa. These are fantastic people. The reason why I would go to live in Africa is because they give me hope. I like to see them do what they do. They create. Someone in Kenya created a whole banking system that the world is now 10 years behind imitating Kenya. Okay? 10 years behind. You know. Someone in South Africa created an airplane that can fly without the nasty stuff that we use. Okay? These are young people who are innovating and creating, but have no access to power. So ultimately, my problem is that how do I reconcile the fact that we brought revolutions by armed means, and now, in our old age, we cannot think about a solution of how to bring change in a peaceful means, when we have learned what violence means, yet we are not able to pass this on to the new generation and provide them the vehicle for taking on and leading us on the future. Thank you much.
I want to say something about who Barbara Deming was and just talk a little bit about the U.S. context and the context out of which her issues and questions about nonviolence emerged. If Barbara had lived, Barbara is an American woman, and if she had lived, she would be 97 years old. So, you know, that's the age that she is. She died about 30 years ago of cancer, and I think I felt, and Matt has felt, and a lot of us who knew her and know her work, that she's much too little known. And we've thought about, wondered about why that is. And I think part of it is that her work is hard. Her prime work that is sort of sets out her thinking is Revolution and Equilibrium. And it's it's available from the War Resisters League. It's as a pamphlet. It's online to be downloaded in various ways. But it's a bear of a piece, as we were saying. So in some way, I think you have to step back from it and put it in the context of the time at which she wrote it. And Barbara basically was a writer who came out of a liberal New York family, went to Friends schools, and became politicized in the 1950s. In the civil rights movement, became more aware in 1959, went to India and became aware of Gandhi and began thinking there. And she was always questioning and in movement, and so she came kind of out of the arts community. But her real question that led to revolution and nonviolence was that at that time in the 60s, in the New Left, of which she was a part, the question was debated, or being debated, as to by what means do we make radical social change, or do we transform society? And I think, there was a certain, some people might disagree with me about this, but I think, a shared goal or shared idea was that a sort of radical democracy, a bottom-up democracy in which people could really participate, in which people took part in politics. And so in some way the New Left was a training ground for people, for democracy, and for people to talk and debate and be part of a social movement at a whole lot of different levels. But one of the central debates was, is revolution made by nonviolent or violent means? Now, we might say today, that this is in some ways a false dichotomy, or it's just not that simple. And so for Barbara put the question of violence at a lot of different levels at her work, and this fed into feminism a lot, physical, psychological, emotional, economic, that there's a whole range of ways in which violence can happen. It's complicated. There's structural violence as well as personal violence. And so the question, though, that she was struggling with in that movement, as she wanted to kind of adhere to leaving the question of violence centrally, was, are there costs to a violent revolution? What are the consequences of a violent revolution? How do we want to go about things? And so she basically set about reading Fanon and trying to understand and think about violence and how it affects a society and what happens, and to also kind of educate people about possibilities for nonviolent social change. In the United States, within the United States, the Quaker tradition, the Secular War Resisters League, religious organizations, there are a whole range of organizations that had practiced nonviolence. And the civil rights movement was where Barbara first came into contact with these ideas and with the practices of direct action, and began to develop what she then articulated later as a two-handed approach, which was an outreached hand, always the possibility of reconciliation, of healing, but a resistance hand. And one of the things that she also said was that one of the problems with pacifism or with nonviolence up to that time was it was not aggressive enough, that nonviolence was not used aggressively enough. So she constantly was putting together these kinds of paradoxes. And she quotes, and so Revolution and Equilibrium is where one of Barbara's methods was a kind of interrogatory, where she would interrogate someone and she would have in her mind and imagine conversation or dialogue with them. And so she quotes Fanon, who says, "What we want to do is go forward all the time in the company of all men." That was the language of the time. But can we escape becoming dizzy? And so this question always of vertigo and dizziness and maintaining an ethical orientation and maintaining humanity or achieving humanity as being central to the process of social change was something that she struggled with all the time. And that then fed into feminism, into her kind of feminism, which I and many other women of my generation picked up. I mean, especially those of us who had been active in multiple movements. My own background was really that I was born in Selma, Alabama, and my first awareness of politics and of the possibility of radical change was the civil rights movement of my childhood. I was in the first generation of Southern children who went to integrated schools and integrated the schools and was part of a lot of political actions, as a young person around those issues. And so I think always for me, when I've gone forward in life and had people question, nonviolence or say this is naive, I can remember, there may be certain situations and contexts in which various things are called for. And Barbara herself, and I would say too, it's not possible, this is a quote from Barbara, "It is not possible to act at all and to remain pure." So the goal is not purity. And that is not what I want when I commit myself to the nonviolent discipline. So, the process of really figuring out, and then this she shared with Fanon, a kind of ethical humanism to undergird the movement. It wasn't simply, the issues of redistribution are certainly there, but the question of what it is that happens to human beings, how we transform ourselves, how we transform each other, and what is called for in the movement and in movements was, I think, a really central concern of hers. And I think part of it also was that she was also a secular person. She was not really drawing on religion, maybe something like an idea of an ultimate concern, but she was very she was just very determined that religion should not really, and ethnicity should not play a large role, that there should be a sense of a common humanity. And so this was something, and within feminism it was important too, because she always resisted the creating of absolute oppositions. So, so I think that one of the things that is important about Barbara and is that she actually lived her life by moving through a number of different movements. She inspired the feminist movement, the lesbian movement, and she always herself was at the forefront of trying to figure out and engage the hard questions and the contradictions. And she, I think what she's been for me is an example. There are other people who do structural political analysis in another way. But Barbara really was a radical Democrat. And the idea that we should in some way create social structures that I think you see the whole left forum this time, it seems, is very devoted to ideas of confederalism, communalism, the question of how bottom-up democracy can take place, and can take place in all kinds of situations all over the world. And the state may be a vehicle for social transformation, but the question of how you create a democratic society and a democratic culture, and the relationship of that to be the means by which change is made. And I think we were talking just a minute ago about the issue. Here in the United States, it's also very difficult to sort of imagine even what could happen, and what could take place. There's certainly, if people want to, there certainly are democratic movements. There's the idea of confronting the state through a violent means is not possible and not desirable. And, so I think that the things that Barbara put in place, and that those of us who've taken part in decentralized movements for radical democracy have put in place, there has to be a kind of long-term view, Barbara would have said, to knitting these things together toward making a future. And so I think for me, also the other thing that was so important about Barbara was that she very clearly saw that there is so much about the world that we live in and the society we live in the United States. She was very involved in the anti-Vietnam War movement as well, that is based and founded on violence, on military power, and on a militarized culture. And we've certainly seen this much more since 9/11, the idea that our foreign policy is based on boots on the ground. We have, I don't even know what the number is now, 800-something bases all over the world. And, there has to be some other way that human beings relate to each other. And given climate change, we also have to be able to figure out how to do some of this really pretty quickly. And so I think, we're at a really turning point in human history where in some way, I'm glad to be part of this group that Matt has put forward here, that through various kinds of creative and nonviolent ways, we have to weave together some sort of way of acting together politically. And you see in all kinds of locales over the world, people resisting the fossil fuel industry, protecting nature and identifying with nature in various places, and a kind of restoration of a sense of relationship with the planet. For some people it's a restoration, for some of us it's a new achievement, or it's something different. And so I think, the question of the whole history of nonviolence is tactics, it's thinking about it as inventing and trying to embody and advance a kind of idea of a human being and of humanity and of humanism that Fanon, Barbara, and others have developed and that goes forward is part of what we need to be thinking about now. Because it's nothing short of a revolution. What has to happen to slow climate change and to make possible even the survival of the planet as we know it? So there's much more to say about all of it, but I think that's some of it.
I'd like you all to keep your fingers crossed or pray or whatever method it is you use. It looks like I'll be able to tell Wende, who is joining us from Philadelphia and who is, it says in the guide, Temple University, and she said, no, really, I was, but I'm one of those denied tenured adjuncts who really is just being paid ridiculously, So she's part of this group Stadium Stompers, and she's part of the major union movement of adjuncts and other poorly paid professional educators in Philadelphia. She's also the author of a book called Potent Manna, which is on healing and power in indigenous communities. And she's going to talk to us today about that connection, that personalist political phrase that we hear often repeated but not necessarily put into daily practice and not revolutionary practice. And if I say go and hit the right buttons, hopefully we'll be able to hear her.
So this is really weird because I have no sense that I'm talking to anybody, but my name is Wende Marshall, and I wanted to say that back in the early 80s when I was running around New York City with Matt and Meyer and the Progressive Campus Network, trying to be a revolutionary, I first read Barbara Deming's essay on revolution and equilibrium, and about 10 years later, when I was in a doctoral program focusing on medical anthropology, I wrote a paper on Fanon's ambivalence to violence, and I particularly drew from a dying colonialism. And although I didn't cite Barbara Deming and didn't remember that I had even read the essay, Revolution and Equilibrium, I'm sure that I was influenced by the essay. So I guess besides that, I want to start by saying that what is clear is that the Western modernity model, capitalism, is killing both earth and people. And I want to talk about the violent daily realities of white supremacist, heteropatriarchal, able-bodied centric capitalism, about the structural violence that affects all of us every minute of every day. And I want to talk about this both at the level of the body and the level of the soul. Because I think soul is a complicated concept for a lot of people. I want to say that soul, in part, is that aspect that allows us to communicate with the ancestors and to know and remember above and beyond and before present realities. So I think we're all very broken, our bodies and our souls. And if revolution is to mean anything, it must profoundly be about healing. And if the revolution is to be about healing the body and the soul, it must be non-violent. And if it's not, it won't ultimately heal us, but will replicate present realities. I taught a class this past semester called Black Bodies, White Power, Healing, and Justice. And I could have heard a pin drop the day I told my students that I thought that white people had the worst part of the deal in the US, and we're very, very broken. I got terrible reviews from the white students in this course, and this may be part of it. But I told them that the kind of loss of humanity that white supremacy entails for many people who see themselves as white is part of the serious brokenness. And so I really was inspired by rereading Barbara Deming's essay about the need to always keep open the possibility of communication. I think that's important. And can I say again that it's really weird to be talking to myself, looking at my computer? I feel like you guys aren't really there. So I wanted to say that I came to understand this. I sort of learned an emphasis on healing, not at all in my medical anthropology program, but when I did ethnographic field work with indigenous Hawaiians in the late 1990s, and learned about healing as an expression of decolonization, and learned about learned the insight that in order for decolonization to be successful, it must happen in the formal political realm, but most profoundly in the body and the soul, down to the level of the cell. So I spent 2 years in Hawaii in the community of Waianae, and although what I learned there was particular to the liberation story of Native Hawaiians, I've come to understand healing as essential to liberation for all of us, and most immediately for African Americans. Part of understanding this, the emphasis on healing, is about understanding the some of the deep-rooted problems with the Western modernity model, with the world we live in now. And for me, dominion and dispossession are clear roots of the problem. Dominion and dispossession are rooted in the Judeo-Christian Islamic world systems, and include the injunction to control and contain the earth and its creatures. I think it's important to see that the enclosure of land and people in the earliest days of capitalism is at the root of the kind of disease that we all suffer, and that dispossession and primitive accumulation, which are iterative and which have happened all over in a repetitive cycle, including colonialism and gentrification, making these things inevitable, is also part of the problem. There's this really sort of lyric moment in Capital when Marx talks about what happens when people were dispossessed from their land, and how they struggled to remember their ancestors, right? They struggled to remember how things had been. And that lyric passage really stood out for me when I was in Hawaii learning about what it meant to be colonized and what it meant to be in a struggle to be decolonized. So, you know, Western modernity, of which capitalism is a primary symptom, has been extremely destructive to conceptions of the relationship between humans, earth, and the divine, between ideas about reciprocity between creatures, between humans and the earth, mutuality, stuff like that. So healing here is centered, the concept of healing that I'm talking about is centered not around humans at the expense of other creatures, but expresses a belonging with earth, and a repair of the rift caused by the hegemony of humanity. So I don't know if that all makes sense to you, and since you can't talk to me, I guess I can't know till later. But it's sometimes hard for me to keep all this in mind in North Philadelphia, where I organized with a group called Stadium Stompers. Stadium Stompers formed in order to fight Temple University's attempt to build a stadium smack dab in the middle of a residential neighborhood. And like other universities, UPenn in particular, Columbia, where you guys are, you know, it's all about land grabbing, dispossessing, and people are really struggling with that. So one of the things, though, that was really powerful for me and helped bring it all home was when I listened to people talk about the way that they belong to North Philadelphia and the way that their family has been there for generations. Some Stadium Stomper members, Stadium Stompers tends to be run by middle-aged Black women, many of whom have parents and grandparents a lot of whom came from South Carolina, came from the South, came from sharecropping backgrounds, and have lived in North Philly since then. And there's this tremendous sense of belonging, and the sense of the land as belonging, and a tremendous sense of the kind of violence that gentrification and dispossession and displacement do to people. I think about healing a lot too, because in the course of Stadium Stompers, which is a new organization, a lot of us have been sick, and so I guess I want to say that we have to think about the ways in which that we will heal each other, and that is the primary responsibility of revolutionary activity, to figure out how we will heal and love and care for each other. And because I can't really see you guys or hear you, that's all I have to say for right now. I sure hope that was coherent. Okay.
Hi, good day. So I am interested in a global movement for a type of global education. And so I've sort of entitled it. So these are very nascent thoughts I have here. So if they seem a little scattered, please forgive me in advance. I'm calling it a trans-border education for global solidarity, priming for revolution. So in this presentation, I'm going to talk about some hindrances to this putative trans-border education. And then I'll give some, again, nascent thoughts, some suggestions on what that can look like. So I think a major hindrance, coming from the field of social psychology, so I'm going to jump around from a bunch of different fields, is in-group, out-group bias, right? And so Tajfel and his colleagues spoke about social identity theory. this principle where we define ourselves as pro-social groupings and that we are quick to denigrate others who don't fit into those groups, right? And so within this room right here, we probably can set up our own sort of in-group identity, right? And it happens actually rather quickly, within a few minutes. Over here? Okay. And anyone who doesn't belong to that group obviously is the out group. And so we have in-group favoritism, and we denigrate those who are part of the out group. And that can be linked around sex, age, race, ethnicity, religion, sexuality, Republicans, Democrats, baseball teams, etc. Right? Some folks in evolutionary psychology claim that this is per our survival. And I could see that, right? There is some merit to that, sort of built into us. There's a famous experiment done by Jane Elliott, a teacher, and it's online, called A Class Divide. You can watch it, very fascinating. She divided these tiny, tiny groups of students, and she said, okay, you have blue eyes and you have brown eyes, and the blue eyes today, you are better than the brown eyes. And in a matter of no time, they started treating those with brown eyes very differently on the playground. Like in a matter of seconds it happened. Then the next day she reversed it. She said, I changed my mind, my mistake, my bad. Those with brown eyes, you are actually better than blue eyes. And the hierarchy was reversed in a matter of seconds. And she has gone on to do lots of work teaching about those experiments and working with people in prison, etc., etc. So Tajfel et al., they say that in-group identification is intensified when we feel morally threatened. Another hindrance, which you may not think, but I think that it has gone too far, is sort of the Age of Enlightenment, the scientific revolution. So obviously there were good things that were emergent from this era, right? So rationality over faith, etc. And you could see the litany that I give there, things that we questioned, and that's good. But I think that there has been a hyper-instrumentalization. As I come from the field of education, so lots of the things I'm positing come from education. From that era, so René Descartes, right, one of the leaders in that revolution, sort of Cartesian duality, mind over body. And I think what is emergent from that is subject-object divisions, which led into, or fed into this logic of coloniality, which I will show in my next slide, as posited by Walter Mignolo. Martin Buber speaks about the division between I and it, and so sort of like, I'm the subject and you are like, so I'm the Lord and you are beneath me, right? And I see you as objects and I treat you as such. And Martin Buber posits that we need to move from I-it relationality to I-thou, so we're subject-subject, right? And I just put a couple examples where we see that playing of master-slave and man over nature, which we see climate change being sort of like an extreme result of that. Another hindrance I posit is nationalism. So this notion of the nation state is actually quite new, right? So around 1640, we had the Peace of Westphalia, a bunch of peace treaties in Europe. And that really was sort of reifying this legal notion of the nation state as a sovereign entity, right? And of course, the French and American revolutions, they really gave birth to this idea of the modern nation state. I argue that even during this time, we have this kind of thing I call revolutionary dissonance, right? So you have all these things happening as coupled with imperialism and colonialism. And a great example, right, I'm from the Caribbean, and so I study Haiti a lot. A great example is Haiti, sort of, being this independent black republic in 1804, and the leader from Haiti writing a letter to the United States saying, hey, we're now free, and you're free, and let's set up relations. And the American president just wrote a note that said, do not respond, right? Because to the Western episteme, the notion of Haiti, it was like dissonant data. It's like what? This is like crazy. They couldn't imagine Haiti as this independent black republic. So it was sidelined, right? Rather intentionally, because it perturbed the Western episteme. It perturbed notions of revolution and modernity. So I argue that also that this battle for self-determination within the colonies of Trinidad, Barbados, they're like, we want to be free, and I think that was a good thing. But I think that clamoring for self-demarcated boundaries, it's getting in the way of this trans-border education that I am envisioning. At the bottom there, I just put some stuff by Benedict Anderson and Edward Said, their notions of imagined communities and imagined geographies. And despite they arguing that nation states and those boundaries are, their perceptions and they're kind of imagined, they still have lots of staying power, right? Obviously, the nationalism, right, and what it means. Another hindrance to this trans-border education is, as I mentioned before, this logic of coloniality and all the things that come along with it, right? So hierarchization, social control, exclusion, and so the regimes of punishment that come along with that, because if excluding people, you kind of need to have regimes of punishment, right? They go hand in hand. As Foucault argues, docilization, dehumanization, emasculation, the whole list, all right? And I just give an example by Said, his wonderful opus, Orientalism, that speaks about this. Another hindrance is mass education. In its beginning, obviously, it's a good thing, right? We want more people to be able to read, right? Literacy is a good thing, and the more you can read what is before you, you are empowered to perhaps pursue social change and change things around you. But again, as I'm arguing with many things that started off good, they have come to an extreme. So mass education has turned into this rather functionalist enterprise, right? Where we're sort of like pigeonholing folks very early into certain certain spheres of existences, etc., etc. And we see it in the Caribbean, we see it in Africa, we see it here in the United States. Here in the US, US is tethered, education is tethered to property rights, right? And so obviously we live in a rather fancy, nice community. It's going to influence the kind of public education that exists in that community. And so I think that mass education, the way it's modeled in the United States, is actually quite ruinous to nonviolent revolution. I've put these two terms together, sort of robotics and rationality, to argue that all of this is creating a sort of robotionality. So obviously technology is a fantastic thing, and I mean I love technology. I'm always working with my kids. I do research in Trinidad on school violence, and I'm arguing that technology should not be marginalized from educational spaces because kids are already steeped in it. And this is why they're not interested in education, because it's an old model, it's antiquated, and the more that we sideline technology is the more that kids will feel alienated from education, and we're seeing the results of that. Lots of dropouts, and kids are just not interested in education. That's happening in the United States as well too. So I argue the age of reason has gone awry. And education, we see sort of hyper-enumerativity and we're trying to count everything. We're trying to count people, right? And we see the ruinous effects of doing that. Robert Epstein argues against seeing or conceptualizing the brain as a computer. He says our shoddy thinking about the brain has deep historical roots, but the invention of computers in the 1940s got us especially confused. They're sort of talking about like we're processing information or pulling data from, so those kind of analogies, he's saying that it's actually not very helpful to the ways in which we should be seeing ourselves. And I think that's linked to, again, René Descartes, saw the body as a machine. And I think we're living with lots of those analogies, and it's getting us into trouble. I argue that we are not the automatons that we create. I also argue that hyper-technicization of human relationality and communication, it has deepened enemy and intrapsychic and interpersonal estrangements. Also, neoliberalism, I think, is also a hindrance to this trans-border education that I envision, right? And I'm not going to go over it, but we know a sense of what neoliberalism is, right? We're living within it. Within the Caribbean, which is where I'm from, an outgrowth of that is what is called structural adjustment programs, and they exist in Africa as well. And in the 1970s and 80s, the West, they were like, hey, we developed in a certain way, and we can give you this very prepackaged pill, which involves privatization, free trade, all that good stuff. You take this pill, this bitter pill, in a short space of time, and it will help you, and you can turn out like the West, right? Very fabulous. And we know that it actually wrecked many economies, and they're still living with lots of those debt. For example, in my own backyard in Jamaica, every dollar of revenue that Jamaica generates, they're paying between 55 cents to 60 cents of every dollar back to pay off the debt from the structural adjustment programs that they took on. So they keep taking on more loans to pay for prior loans, right? And to me, that's intentional, right? It's a form of neocolonialism, right? As Kassahun spoke about earlier on, right? And so this age of mass overconsumption and seeing everything as per the bottom line, all of those things, to me, are hindrances to this trans-border education. So this is not an exhaustive list by any means, but I'm thinking of we need to create an ethic of planetary consciousness through different forms of education. So not just one kind of education, right? So I'm thinking of an umbrella of educations, right? Excuse me. Dr. Keltner over at Berkeley, they have a Greater Good laboratory. You should check them out if you haven't already. They're doing some wonderful stuff in neuroscience and looking at the evolutionary roots of compassion. You're pretty much saying that we're wired to care, which is important because you often hear that, you know, we are savage beasts and we are primed for war and violence and all that good stuff. He's also arguing that we are wired to care and that compassion and generosity are contagious, right? He says, forget what you've been told about compassion, that it's unnatural, that it's for suckers. Compassion is essential to our evolutionary history. It defines who we are as a species and it serves our greatest needs as individuals to survive, to connect, and to find our mates in life. I'm also coupling what he's saying with the recent research on neuroplasticity, which is very exciting, right? I mean, before we were told that as a child, you know, it's like your brain is formed and bam, that's it, you can't change, right? And this research on neuroplasticity is very encouraging. It's showing that absolutely we can be primed to think and act in very different ways, right? And so I'm arguing that we absolutely can learn new ways of being in the world. So what does this look like? So some suggestions. Yeah, you can take my chair if you want, this black chair in front here. Yeah, welcome. So I'm from the field of peace education, right, which argues for education about peace. So that's the content portion, arguing about peace. So peace content, and so the great peace leaders, all that good stuff, but also education for peace. So what are the dispositions and the attitudes you need to inculcate a global culture of peace, right? In peace education, we focus on both negative peace and positive peace. So negative peace is a cessation of physical violence. Positive peace is focusing on the dismantling of structural violence, right? And you put those two together and that's comprehensive peace education, right? So we believe that both have to go together, right? So negative peace is a necessary but insufficient part of the calculus. You need to go a step further, many steps further. We need to teach about systems blindness, which is a term from Barry Oshry. He's saying that we get so enmeshed within our various worlds, our various spheres, that we just can't see the comprehensive whole. And all of those things I spoke about, the hindrances, those things are getting in the way, right? Those things are adding to systems blindness, yeah? And so I think in schools we absolutely need to teach about systems thinking, like intentionally so. We're encouraging students to connect the parts, seeing more wholes. We need more interdisciplinary research, which is why my presentation is pulling from different fields. I can't just stay in the field of education. I need to pull from different fields so I can see more of the whole, while understanding that I could never see the whole, right? But pushing myself to see more of the whole. Technology. And so often I hear teachers saying it's like Snapchat, all this other way kids are speaking now, just throw it all out. I'm like, no. Let's keep the baby, let's throw out maybe the bath water, but maybe we can reimagine bathrooms and perhaps what it even means to bathe, right, in technological terms, right? Finding, creating, focusing on planetary superordinate goals. And so, for example, after 9/11 here in the United States, people were no longer Republicans and Democrats and Independents. People were American after 9/11. They came together because there was a superordinate goal, right? This threat to American existence. So I'm saying we need to create a planetary superordinate goal. And we kind of have some already, right? The threat of climate change, that is a superordinate goal, and we kind of need to be teaching more about that, right? And so a superordinate goal is that everyone cooperates so that everyone can be rewarded, right? That's a basic premise, right? We need to foster more interdependence in education over competition. And we absolutely can teach that, right? Like in Montessori school education, they teach that, more interdependence over competition, right? Mary Parker Follett, 1920s and 30s, she's not well known, but she should be, right? Postulated power with versus power over, right? Power over is undergirded by that logic of coloniality. And power with is very participatory, right? Power with people, right? Nell Nording speaks about an ethic of care, right? So not just caring for people, but caring for objects, caring for ideas. So a reverence for different forms of life, right? I think that's absolutely integral to this transborder education. Of course, Paulo Freire, in his famous Pedagogy of the Oppressed, if you haven't read it, I absolutely encourage. It's the one text that sort of ripped the ground, the colonial ground from beneath me, sort of epistemologically, and shook my whole world. He speaks about banking education. He says education is where you're just like depositing knowledge into like tabula rasa, right? And then you ask the kids to regurgitate the information, right? That's a very colonial model of education. And actually mass education looks like that as well. So he argues for a problem-posing education, education that is generative, an education where you're always asking questions, right? Where there is no end per se. You get to a certain point and you're like, okay, let's ask more questions, right? So that's a problem-posing education. And I'm arguing that we need to create options for an array of problem-posing educations with an S, right? Because critical peace education argues that no kind of education should be prescriptive. Right? Right? Shouldn't be deterministic. We should always have room for more and more types of being in the world. I argue that experiential education is also a key part of this trans-border education. Right? There's a quote from the Asaro tribe of Indonesia and Papua New Guinea. They say that knowledge is just a rumor until it lives in the muscle. Right? And I absolutely believe that. I mean, shoot, when I do something, it sticks with me. Right, as opposed to those classes where they just tell me about it. The things where I actually get to experience it. It really sits in the bone, sits in the muscle, right? There's that kind of muscle memory. And then, it's funny that Wende spoke about healing. I absolutely believe that because of the harm rendered by the logics of coloniality, that we need to do lots of healing work as part of a trans-border education. And that could come in the form of restorative justice circles, appreciative inquiries, truth and reconciliation commissions, but we need to really do lots of healing work and collectively atone for the harm that we have rendered on each other. And I think this stuff can really be helpful in working against sort of the logics and poetics of hierarchization, because we need to horizontalize relations, human relations, right? And fostering more participation, and so that healing work is really necessary. And so the work I do in Trinidad is lots of restorative circles, right? Whenever folks say, come and talk to this class, they're giving problems, they're kind of out of control. I'm like, I'm not gonna come talk to them, I'm gonna come talk with them. And let's start with forming a circle so I can actually hear about their pains and their stories and their histories, because that's important before I can even like lecture to them, which I'm not going to, about how to behave, right? We need to understand why they're behaving the ways in which they're behaving. And so I said, this is not an exhaustive list, these are just some suggestions. But I think at the core, we need to have what I call iterative praxis, right? Where we shouldn't be foreclosed into thinking about this is the end product, right? And so everything I talk about has an S at the end, right? It's a plurality, right? In part of priming for revolution, whenever I'm teaching or working with kids, I'm always thinking of micro-revolutions. That you hear a revolution with an R, it's like it seems so big and you seem so small, and how can I play a part in helping to change the world? And I'm like, listen, just in your very being, that's a micro-revolution, right? Just in you coming to school and wearing that rainbow band on your hand and kids calling you again, the fact you still choose to wear that, that's a micro-revolution, because it's giving the courage to another kid to perhaps come out of the closet or to stand out or stand up or give voice, right? And so I absolutely believe in micro-revolutions. And in the end, I just think that we should be pushing for iterative existential dispositions toward reconnectivity and decolonization, so again with an S, so we can perpetually co-envision sustainable futures. Thank you.
Let's hear it again for Hakim, please. Thank you very much. I'm going to try to do a few things quickly and move to Q&A. The first thing is to say that this panel was put together, yes, by our own connections that we've been developing over some time, but also by a number of co-sponsoring groups, some of whom are here in the room and some of whom are not here in the room, that really deserve our thanks, not just for this morning, but for all of the things they do in life and all of the things they do at the Left Forum, is Deep Dish TV, who are audio taping and videotaping this. So thank you, Deep Dish. If I get the tech part of this in line, I'm going to have on the screen their new address, because along with the A.J. Muste Institute, another co-sponsoring group that has a brand new piece of literature with the brand new address, you will know that what used to be 339 Lafayette Street, the Peace Pentagon, is no more. But the groups in that orbit and more are still working together and still working to build stronger, more vibrant movements through actually what we think will be better, accessible, and also inviting movement spaces. And that not quite opened the new space, but it will be at 168 Canal Street. that address is on this brochure and will be on the screen in a moment. This is also being co-sponsored by two presses, two small independent movement left presses. Movement left presses survive only through one method, that is by you buying their books. One of them is Africa World Red Sea Press, and the other is PM Press. I don't have Africa World Press books with me right now. You can criticize me later for that.
I will.
But I do have some PM Press books. There's a big table downstairs, and one of the books that deals with some of these issues, co-published by the War Resistance League, is the book We Have Not Been Moved. So please, if you have a little extra money in your pockets, come and buy some books at the end of this time together. You'll also notice I just put on the screen the new address. I actually think I got one digit off on the zip code. It's 10013, not 1003.
Yeah.
And yes, the Barbara Deming essay, actually produced by the A.J. Muste Memorial Institute, another of the co-sponsoring groups, as I say, is available. And neither Africa World nor PM Press, but a book you should check out is Wende's book, which I also put on the screen, Potent Man: Lessons in Power and Healing. I'll also now say as my final, I think, did I get? Yes, I got all the co-sponsors, I got all the pitches, I made all the public service announcements and advertising commercials. So now we'll go to Q&A, but before we do that, I do also want to say, I know Deep Dish needs to, or has said they need to leave about now, and it's a bit disruptive. So I want to forgive them for the disruption, but I don't want to end the session now. We've got till 11:50, so I think we should have the conversation, but if you guys need to leave, we understand that, and thank you, and let's open it up. Sam, please,
We have
please.
to set up for another panel.
We understand. We love you. It's okay. Maybe take Sam's question and then go. Sam, start us off, man. And tell us who you are in case anyone doesn't know.
Well, my name is Sam Anderson. I'm a native of Bed-Stuy, Brooklyn, New York. To make a long story short. The presentations were very informative, but I see something that is missing that ran through, I think, all of the presentations, and that is the issue of white supremacy / racism, and how that's connected to all of the negative aspects of the development of capitalism and imperialism, and the capitalist education system, as the brother laid out, is important, but what is central to that is the issue of how the capitalist system perpetuates itself culturally is through the white supremacist construct. And it's a complex construct that weaves in a number of false assumptions. And it weaves it into the point where it's so normalized that we don't even think about it. And there's a young lawyer friend of mine she's black, and she says, I am a recovering white supremacist. You know, it's addiction. And she's a black woman who has to struggle with the internalization of white supremacy. And we need to understand that through all of these weavings of the peace, education stuff, the ongoing devolution of the African struggle for independence. What's woven in all of this mess is this issue of white supremacy, the policies and the internalization of those concepts. And I think we need to address that. It is not a question of either it's a class thing or a race thing. It's I use the term CLACE. It's class and race, and that we need to understand how white supremacy / racism feeds into these negative controls that the capitalist system has, so that what we produce as alternatives we need to have that that anti-racist, anti-white supremacist aspect as part of it, and which I did not see or hear, let's say, discussed in terms of how we heal, how we build a more productive, selfless society, right? We need to deal with that. That's my point.
Thank you, Sam. I want to. We want to have responses. I kind of want to, because I think that's so central, actually, that I would love to hear people respond. And could you see if Wende wants to respond? Because I know it's actually an issue Wendy's given a lot of thought and work to.
When you want to respond? I guess you got to bring her back up.
Did
here.
she say yes?
Can you point me to the audience, because I can only see the ceiling. Sorry.
So,
Hi.
does she want to respond to Sam, or?
No, go ahead, Matt.
Okay. Do we want to have other responses, or just from the audience some more questions and comments and all that? Huh? I'm going to make a quick response, and then let's hear some more. I mean, I basically want to just thank Sam. I want to thank you for that, because I do feel like in trying to connect the various pieces of the contemporary puzzle, I think pieces do get lost. And I think you're right about that getting lost in some ways in this last hour. I mean, I don't see how one can talk about Fanon, one can talk about Pan-Africanism, and even really one can talk about Freire or Barbara Deming without talking about white supremacy, without understanding that as a context and subtext. And I guess there's a reason why when we put together some of the conversations about revolutionary nonviolence in book form, and it hasn't been done too much, we called it We Have Not Been Moved. We call that book that, really to not only reverberate from the days of the Black liberation movement to the 50s, 60s, and 70s, and the idea that what King called the triplets, right, of contemporary evil, militarism, materialism, and racism, essentially, white supremacy, that we wanted to focus on racism, or the race and military connection, because it seemed like that is the piece, the fundamental piece that keeps coming up as a disconnect in our understanding. We love Howard Zinn and people's history, and yet we look at that people's history and we see, and we keep seeing, how many pieces even that great history leaves out. And it leaves out a fundamental and systemic analysis of white supremacy. So, I mean, many of us look to people like Jay Sakai and the book Settlers, The Myth of the White Proletariat. I see now there are different riffs on this question. Roxanne Dunbar-Ortiz is here this weekend talking about indigenous people's history. But anyway, you slice and dice it without dealing with white supremacy, you don't really understand the systemic nature of empire, and you can't really be a functioning anti-imperialist. So I just really wanted to thank Sam for that.